Well, hey there. Welcome to Mosaic Community Church, where we are now almost at the end of the book of 1 Kings. Basically, we've just got today and then next week, and then we're going to be finished. And so if you have a Bible there, you might like to have that open with you today at chapter 18. We're going to be looking at the second half, and that way you can follow along as we begin to wind things down. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. You can simply follow along with the passages as they come up on your screen. Well, apparently one of the biggest buildings in the world is what is known as the Vertical Assembly Building, also known as the Vehicle Assembly Building at the NASA Kennedy Space Center. Maybe you've seen it on TV there in the distance when they launched the space shuttle. It's the building where they actually put the space shuttle together before rolling it out onto the launch pad. And this particular building, the vehicle or vertical assembly building, is so huge that it is said to have the largest set of doors on Earth. Not just that, but also has a whopping internal volume of some 3.5 million cubic meters. Give you just an idea of how big that is. People tell us that you could fit the Empire State Building 3.5 times into this NASA Kennedy Space Center. If you want to put it in an Australian context, think about it this way. Next time you go down to the local Bunnings, just spend a couple of moments wandering around inside, get a feel for how big that building is, and then imagine another building which is 70 to 100 times larger than that. And you're starting to get close to just how big this vertical assembly building really is. In fact, it is so big that it is said to even have its own weather. In fact, NASA employees have reported rain clouds forming inside of the building on humid days. So this is a massive building. However, here's the thing though, and that is that whenever tourists visit this NASA Kennedy Space Center and they see this vertical assembly building, and they see it for the first time from a distance, they nearly always say the same thing. And that is, they'll always say, well, yeah, it's big, but it's not as big as I thought it would be. Are you really sure that this is truly one of the largest buildings in the world? Because I just thought it would look so much bigger than that. And then the tourist guide will always say something like this, that, yeah, it is really that big. It's just that there is nothing else around to compare it to. And so it can be deceiving. In other words, stuck out there on Cape Canaveral with barely anything else around, let alone another building to compare it to, people end up getting tricked. And so they don't think that it is nearly as big as it really is. However, I wonder though, do you reckon that the same thing can happen between us and God? I mean, one of the very first songs that we teach our kids is, My God is so big. You know the song, the kids' song, My God is so big, so strong and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. That's true. I mean, he is a big God. But I wonder, do we really get just how big and how strong, how powerful, how mighty the God of the Bible truly is? I mean, with what do you compare the God of all the universe? What do you compare the God who simply spoke the world and who called the universe and all of creation into being with? What do you compare him against? Friends, there's nothing that comes even close to comparing a God like that to a God who just created everything by speaking into existence. And so I wonder if it actually puts us in danger of underestimating just how big and how powerful the God of the Bible truly is. So to show you what I mean, have a look with me at this final section of 1 Kings 18, just here, bearing in mind that we've now spent the last several weeks setting up this final confrontation between Yahweh, who is the God of the Bible, and whom Elijah, as his prophet, is seeking to call the people of Israel back to as their true God or as the true God. And then on the other hand, you've got this pagan God by the name of Baal, and who is really no God at all. But he's been represented, as it were, by Ahab and Jezebel and the religious or false prophets of their day as this new God and new religion which is to be embraced within Israel. And so Given that we've already spent so much time now already over the past couple of weeks unpacking some of the fundamental background to this passage, I don't want to really go over those things again, but what I do want to do is begin to wind down by just highlighting, as it were, today, 5 simple truths which this passage now teaches us about the God of the Bible and about how and why these things are just really good news for us. Beginning with this, and that is that first up, there is no place in the world in which God, the true God, the God of the Bible, is not completely and utterly all-powerful or in absolute control. There is no place in the world in which God is not truly God and is not completely and utterly all-powerful or in absolute control. So to show you what I mean, have a look with me just there at verses 1 and 2, and then in verses 17 to 25 as we pick up from where we left off last week. It starts in verse 1 of chapter 18, that after a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah saying, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." And so Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. So again, just to put this into context really, really quickly, remember there's just now been 3 years of famine and drought throughout the land of Israel and the surrounding territories of Canaan. And what the people are finding is that a false religion or false gods, a defective worldview, or a wrong understanding of reality, an understanding of reality which is not true, ends up being completely useless. It cannot do anything to help you. And so that's what's happening here. After 3 years of famine and drought, the true God now comes to Elijah. He says, "Look, you go and you present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." And so Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now, verse 17, when he saw Elijah, that is, when Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. For you have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." And so Ahab sent word throughout all of Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Now Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Therefore, go get 2 bulls for us, and let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. And I'll prepare the other bull, and I will put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Look, choose one of the bulls. You prepare it first, since there are so many of you, and call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." And so they took the bull given to them, and they prepared it. And then they called upon the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar that they had made. Well, even today, in many parts of the world, there is still a belief, if you like, in territorial spirits or in certain gods who have power in certain areas. And look, there might very well be territorial spirits. I'm not ruling that out. But even if there are, that still does not nullify the overall teaching of the Bible that Yahweh, the God who made the heavens and the earth and everything in them, that he is Lord and ruler even in those places where he isn't worshipped and where another God or another spirit is said to be the power in that place. And so notice therefore the reason for Elijah telling them in verse 19. He says, look, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. And so verse 20, Ahab and all the people and all the prophets, they gathered together at Mount Carmel. Now, here's the question. That is, what is the reason for choosing Mount Carmel? Why go there? Well, simply put, Mount Carmel is, it was or is, this bluff which extended out some 11 miles out into the Mediterranean Sea, or out into the Mediterranean. It's a series of limestone hills, and in the ancient Near East, it was known as Holy Head, or the Mountain of Baal. And this apparently was the territory in which Baal was the ruling spirit, the ruling god. And so out there on this bluff or this mountain, it's kind of like the landscape it's kind of like where we might build a lighthouse, but where for these people, they had built a pagan altar instead. And so in their minds, Mount Carmel was considered to be sacred ground for Baal, meaning that when Elijah summons them to come out to Mount Carmel, what he is doing is he is giving to Baal and to his prophets that which we would call a home ground advantage. So that for those of you who follow a sport like footy or cricket, you know what I'm talking about. Basically, when a team gets to play at their home ground, they get to enjoy the benefits, supposedly, of being more familiar with the grounds, as well as the psychological boost of having a greater number of their fans in that place. And so that's what is happening here. Baal is supposed to have the home ground advantage, and he's got all his prophets there. But here's the thing. Is God worried? No. Why? Well, because geography or political or religious or so-called spiritual boundaries do not affect the true God. I mean, you can't just lock God out by simply building a wall or imposing a different state religion, or by changing the government, changing your religion, or by saying to God, I don't want you here. It doesn't work like that. Why? Well, because there is no place anywhere in the world in which God is not completely and utterly all-powerful and in complete control. There is no place in the world in which God is not God. I was thinking about this just recently, even as you go into the New Testament and you begin to see Jesus, and as he's casting out demons, it's really, really interesting that the two most common things that the demons will say in response to the power and the authority of Jesus is either, one, don't destroy us, or two, do not send us out of the area. Why? Well, because they recognize that this Jesus, he has power and he has authority over the evil spirits, over territorial spirits, whatever you want to call them. It kind of reminds me of this quote by Abraham Kuyper. To paraphrase him, he once said that there is no place in all of creation in which God is not God, or in which Jesus is not Lord of all, and over which Jesus has not said, mine. That is mine. I created it. It's mine, as the true God. And so that's the first lesson here. There's no place in the world in which God is not all powerful. And the problem with God, if you like, is that he keeps trespassing into, well, he's not trespassing because it's his world. But we see it as trespassing into his world and into our lives by going where, people are trying to keep him out and he just ignores it. And so in defeating Baal on his home soil, or on his home ground, so to speak, God is about to remind us of who is truly God within the world. Which brings us this second thing, and that is that God does not need to be popular in order to be true or to be powerful. In fact, you might even put it this way, that God doesn't even need us to somehow prop him up and to help him be God. You notice again, in verse 19, there are some 450 prophets of Baal plus 400 prophets of Asherah. I mean, that makes a grand total of some 950 people. And that's just the clergy. That's not even counting the rest of the people who would come out. And so little wonder then that Elijah says in verse 22 that, look, I am the only one here to represent Yahweh, but you, on the other hand, you've got some 450 prophets just for Baal, And again, verse 25, throwing down the challenge, said, look, you go first. Why? Well, because there's so many of you. So in other words, if this were being reported today, we might read of God's plummeting approval ratings. We might read about how God and his church are in decline. However, the thing which we're about to be reminded of here, and which we need to be reminded of often, is that God's power has never been dependent upon how many cheerleaders he has. So here's the thing. And that is, even if there wasn't one person in the world who still followed God, he would still be the majority. He would still be big, and he would still be both powerful and in absolute control. He doesn't need to be popular in order to be true or to be powerful. He is what he is in and of himself. And which brings us this third thing, and that is that thirdly, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, is a God who doesn't need a song and dance from us in order to get his attention. He's not a God who needs to have his arm twisted by us to somehow get him to act and to come through for us. So you notice here that not only does Baal have some 450 prophets as opposed to Yahweh, who seemingly only has one on his side, but in their thinking, they're assuming something like this, that because Baal is more popular, he therefore must be more powerful. That's part of it. But there's also this other thinking as well, which suggests that, look, the more zealous and the more people you have who are zealous for their God or for your God, well, then the more likely that God is to come through for you. And so have a look what happens in verse 26. They called upon the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's God. But perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. And so in verse 28, they shouted louder, slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Verse 29, midday passed. They continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. In other words, notice here, if you will, that the actions and the attitudes of Baal's prophets are full of all kinds of religious fervor and mass hysteria and religious hype, as the prophets of Baal begin quite literally whipping themselves into a frenzy. And they're trying to get Baal's attention. They're trying to get Baal to answer their prayers, and they're trying to get him to do what they need him to do. And there's a cheer squad of some 950 plus more of them whipping themselves into this religious frenzy. But not Elijah. I mean, don't get me wrong, Elijah is every bit as sincere and as earnest as the prophets of Baal are. But as we'll see in a moment, Elijah, as someone who knows the true God, doesn't need to be frantic about it or desperate about it. He's not out there competing, trying to get God to notice him, which we'll see a bit more of in a few moments. But it brings us to this fourth thing, and that is that the God of the Bible will often use our own complete and utter inability. In other words, the God of the Bible will often use our weakness and our powerlessness as his own starting point. So he's not dependent upon us. And you can see this just there, verses 30 to 35. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him. He repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." And with those stones, he built an altar to the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said. They did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. I mean, one is almost tempted to say here that Elijah is kind of an even bigger problem for God than the prophets of Baal are. Why? Well, because as someone else once put it, a half-pagan brain might think that Elijah had just ruined God's chances of pouring not one, not three, not six, but 12 jars of water over the wood before praying for God to come and burn up this sopping mess. It's a lot of water he's poured over this wood and over this animal offering. And look, I realise that this is the 9th century BC, but I don't think people were so completely witless that they didn't realise that wet stuff doesn't burn. I mean, they would have known that. And so what Elijah is doing here, if you like, is he's stacking the decks against God, so to speak. So if that fire doesn't come down, and he's making it as hard as possible for God, but he's stacking the decks against God so that if that fire does come down, there can be no other explanation except that it is God who has truly done it, not him. However, let me just come back again to that third point a moment ago, just by way of application. About, God doesn't need a song and a dance from us either to get him to come through for us. So I think it would be easy to assume that, Elijah is simply casual and the prophets of Baal is intense. But I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, Elijah is every bit, well, not every bit, but Elijah is intense. He's earnest. He prays, verse 37, very passionately, "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again." But the difference is, you'll notice here that Elijah knew what God was really like, though. And so he doesn't feel he needs to get out there and badger or coerce or manipulate or blabber or bleed half the day just to get God to hear him. He's not putting on a song and dance like the prophets of Baal and trying to get God's attention. "Look at me, God. Can I get your attention, please?" He's not doing that. But what about us, though? I mean, for those of us who are Christian believers, I mean, we can read this passage and we can feel somewhat detached from it, as though somehow it's not relevant to us, or as though we're somehow completely different to these people. I mean, after all, we don't carry on with all this pagan hullabaloo. We're not gashing or cutting ourselves. We're not pagan blockheads. Well, true, we might be a little bit more refined, maybe. But notice as well the assumption on which these people are operating, and which is this, and that is that, look, God will begin to do things if only we get a flurry of passionate religious activity going. And so I wonder whether, as one person put it, we sometimes have our own evangelical Baalism, whereby we seem to believe that, well, look, God will only work if, and you can fill it in. God's only going to work if we spend more time in personal devotions. Or God is only going to work if we spend more time in private prayer. Or if he's only going to work in your life if you belong to a home group or an accountability group. Or God's only going to be able to work if only we can get more visitation or outreach going. If only we could hold more marriage enrichment seminars, or get more scripture teachers, or run a particular service, dim the lights, do a short-term mission, get the right music, buy a bus, whatever it is. God will only work if we can get a big number of people and all in complete and perfect agreement. It's the same kind of thinking, and it can be completely and as thoroughly exhausting and as busy as these guys are just here, except without all the gashing and stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that those things aren't legitimate activities. I'm not opposed to the need for spending more time in prayer and worship and the study of God's word. All I'm saying is that we need to be very careful of our motivations. Why are we doing those things? See, let me put it this way, that when we participate in those different activities, Are we doing so as a means of grace, and because the Spirit of God is at work within us and he's spilling over? Or are we simply doing them as a gimmick or as a means to manipulate and impress or somehow stir up God? Because we really need God to come through for us on this. And so, we might not be prophets of Baal, but sometimes we can think like one when we tell ourselves that if only I do this, or if only we did this, then God will, and again, fill it in. And I think Jesus, he makes the same point in Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says that when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases like the pagans do, because they think that they will be heard because of their many words. He says, don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then like this. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that pagans pray a certain way because they think a certain way. That is, they think their prayers will be heard because their prayers are long. Or they've got the right words, they've got the right stuff happening. But if you know the real God, who is your Heavenly Father and who knows what you need even before you ask him, then your praying is going to be different. It's going to be brief, it's going to be simple, it's going to be to the point, it's going to be full of faith and expectation, just as Elijah's was. So I like the way one person put it when he said this, that because Elijah knew the real God, he didn't need to ape the antics or the hype of Baal's prophets. And then he asks this very telling question. He says, do you or others see the relief that enters your life and ministry when you serve the real God? It's a great question, isn't it? Do people see the relief that enters your life and your ministry when you're serving the real God? Well, you don't have to beat yourself up. You don't have to put on a song and dance. You don't have to twist God's arm. You don't have to try and, shake heaven and get God to somehow notice you. Now, compare the frantic and painful religion of Baal's prophets against that of Elijah. As in verse 30 and following, Elijah then said to the people, come here to me. And they came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. And Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. Verse 32, with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And verse 36, at the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. Verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. He didn't have to do a song and dance. He knows a God who hears and who answers prayer. A God who is able to start with our own powerlessness, who makes our own inability his own starting point. But there's something else here as well, just as we're closing up. And that is, you'll notice that the God of the Bible, the true God, is also a God who is rich in mercy and overflowing with grace. Let me explain. Israel must have been in very bad shape spiritually in order to warrant God's intervention with such an overwhelming and powerful and raw miracle as this. It was as though this is the absolute length that God had to go in order to draw his people back. And so this here, it's an evidence of God's grace that he would do that for them. But there are also other ways in which God's grace is seen. The first one's obvious, and that is that the way in which he has answered Elijah's prayer without, as we said, him having to go into an absolute song and dance, as it were. That's grace. But the other demonstration of grace is maybe not so obvious, but it is quite simply this: that Elijah is God's prophet who rebuilds, verse 30, the altar of the Lord, which had previously been torn down. He rebuilds the altar of the Lord for these people, the altar of God which had been torn down. In other words, despite the fact that these 10 northern tribes of Israel had separated themselves from the two southern tribes of Judah. So there was this tear in the people, this tear in the national fabric. Nonetheless, this altar is rebuilt not with 10 stones, not with 2 stones, but with 12 stones. And then despite the fact that they, having gone their own way, have been cut off from the legitimate temple, and which was the place in which God had promised to hear his people, forgive his people, to bless his people. Remember that from a couple of weeks ago? Nevertheless, even though they're not even at the temple in Jerusalem, God answers his people in this place and with fire from heaven. And it's as though God is saying, look, you've been cut off from me, and yes, you have sinned. Yes, you have separated me from me. Yes, you have been following a God which is really no God. But here is a way back, and here is an altar which is for you. Here is an altar rebuilt in order that the people might have a place of grace and reconciliation. And so that God might say to his people, here is an old, rugged altar that you might have a place of atonement where I will forgive your sin and I will receive you back in order that I might be your God once more and that you might be my people. And so the answer to Elijah's prayer just here is the evidence that not only is the Lord truly God, but he is a gracious God who is inviting his people to return to him. How much more true for us then, and how much more gracious in our case, that God would provide for us with an even greater provision at the cross of Christ. Now, true, at the cross of Christ, we don't see fire falling from heaven like we do here, but what we do see is the wrath of God and the love of God meeting at the cross of Jesus, as God invites us to this place where he forgives our sin, receives us back in order that he might be our God and that we might be his people. That's grace. That's a God who is rich in mercy. So much so that the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 5, the Apostle Paul put it this way when he says, you see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, there it is, Christ died for the ungodly. He did for us that which we could not do for ourselves. Now, very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And since we've now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Not only is this so, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. And so therefore, let us remember this in closing, that God never allows us to leave the cross or to go beyond the cross. Rather, what he will do is he will continually take us more deeply into the cross, reminding us that he is a God who is rich in mercy and overflowing in grace. Amen. Let's pray.